If you don't understand how the company makes money, you cannot contribute to those conversations in any sort of meaningful way. And moreover, no one's going to listen to you when you do. I do think that as you become more aware of how the company generates revenue, what are the, it's always about what are the problems that the leadership is dealing with and understanding how you in your department can help to affect change with those problems, solve those problems. And I think that's, understanding how the organization works, what your role is in the organization, and then looking at, we go back to the data, looking at, what is it that you have in your chest of solutions that you can provide to the leadership.
Welcome to the People Managing People podcast. We're on a mission to build a better world of work and to help you create happy, healthy, and productive workplaces. I'm your host, David Rice. My guest today is Julie Mahfouz Rezvani. She is the managing director of the Orion Group. We're going to be talking about something every HR leader should know and understand, and that is the revenue model that drives their business. Julie, welcome.
Thank you.
When we were talking before this, you were mentioning to me about the difference between HR being in the admin lane versus affecting real change. And this is kind of where I want to start this conversation, is sort of what defines that shift and what signs tell you an HR team is still stuck in admin mode.
It's a topic that I think is quite interesting because HR often, especially as they increase in leadership, they want to get into those spaces where those decisions are being made. And I think that's the sort of the biggest telling sign is, which tables are you at? Are you still doing benefits administration and payroll forms and like compliance administration? Or are you sort of proactively involved in those conversations where strats being discussed, strategy plans and workforce planning and the acquisitions, maybe companies that are looking at sort of acquiring? Are you in those conversations or are you being given the memo afterward? So I think that's a big telling sign as to sort of which table you're sat at. And I think, it's, are you a part of those, identifying what are those outcomes that you're looking for, that the organization is looking for? Or are you sort of coming, sort of more to operationalize what the organization has already determined, especially through, for example, through strategy planning? Are you somebody who's sort of given the strategy and told, okay, now go operationalize this? Or are you a part of actually coming up with that strategy for your organization?
It's interesting. A lot of HR leaders, they know the org chart, right? They're very familiar with sort of the people practices and processes, but maybe they're not so familiar with the revenue model. And I'm curious, what are the most sort of essential financial metrics that HR has to understand if they're going to prove themselves in those executive conversations and get into those other meetings, be seated at that other table?
Yeah, look, I mean, I know, of course, through the work I do, a lot of HR people, and I would hate to stereotype that finance is generally not an area that most of them either enjoy, feel comfortable with, unless maybe they're on the comp side. So it's not complex. I don't think that the data that we're looking for that they should know is complex. I mean, a lot of them can tell you about things like turnover and how many people, left the organization and how long it takes to hire somebody or what the costs are. I think we want to go beyond that. So I deal with a lot of like high growth startups, and a lot of them, want to know things like the revenue per employee. You should know that. You should know, even if they're cost centers, like overall, what is the revenue per employee? What's the value of an employee's lifetime? So, are you, when it comes to retention, are you retaining people long enough? And then what's the cost of not retaining people? So a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, again, this is how much it costs to advertise, or this is sort of the lead time, and this is the impact that you have on morale. Let's make that into numbers so people on the other end can understand, what is the loss of that productivity in dollars and cents? What is the actual spend? How about the onboarding time? How about the training? Oftentimes you get employers who are very sort of dug in on salaries, and sometimes when you come back to them and being able to say, like, listen, we're talking about X number of dollars, that in the round of how much you're going to spend if you don't keep this employee is, significantly less. And so I think people need to know what those numbers are and being able to sort of articulate them. So those are, I think, the metrics that I would sort of start with. And it also then shows that you understand the business. I remember being in a conversation many, many years ago, because before I got into HR, I was in sales. And I remember the CFO of our organization came to me and said, there's a word that a lot of people don't understand, and especially HR people, and that's profit. And at that time I laughed, but it's important. Like you can't sort of work in silos, and sometimes HR is doing that. So the more you understand about the numbers and how they impact the organizations, what's the CFO looking for? What keeps him or her up at night? I think that's really important to know.
Yeah, I think, HR, a lot of folks, they get kind of pulled into tracking certain data types, right? You mentioned hires, exits, engagement scores, things like that. I am curious though, like, are there more deep or maybe commercially relevant metrics that HR teams really got to start using? And why does that matter so much for their people strategy?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think understanding everything you do on the people side as it relates to growth, as it relates to revenue, as it relates to longevity for the company. So, it's being able to, I think, come to the table, utilization rate, right? So, like, when do you decide that you, especially again, working with smaller companies that, are a little bit tighter on cost because they're newer and they're maybe being funded, they have to really watch sort of, how quickly they scale. When do you decide that you're going to hire somebody new? When is that decision made? And oftentimes it's are you looking at the utilization rate? Are you saying that, that are you able to articulate when's the right time, not just based on, sometimes it's about like look at the data, bring the data forward and make it very clear, not only that this is the right time to hire, but what's the consequences of not hiring? How is that going to impact the scaling? And again, putting that back into dollars and cents.
When we were talking before this, you said something I thought was really, really insightful. And you said HR often has the right data, but not the right language. I'm curious, in your opinion, how can HR leaders sort of present insights in ways that resonate with different business stakeholders and move decisions forward, around that language?
I think, first of all, a lot of that data is there, right? So knowing your audience, who are you speaking to? Who cares about what? So I don't think that the same data should be presented to the COO versus the CEO versus the CFO. So it depends on who you're talking to and what's the purpose of the conversation. If we look at COOs, oftentimes they're looking at efficiency. So that's the data you should be bringing to them. If you're looking at CFOs, obviously we're looking at things like cost per hire or, the cost of retention. Well, CEOs, we're looking, I think more at like sort of morale, and we're looking at overall culture in the company and how the company's going to sort of move forward. So I think you'll have to be very aware of who your audience is, and then being able to sort of bring it back to basic things that people can understand. So, for example, like the Society of Human Resource Management says that turnover costs, I think it's 6 to 9 months of a salary. So, take that, don't say 6 to 9 months, so bring it back and say, okay, well, this is how much it's going to cost to replace David. And so, if he wants 10 grand more, like give him the 10 grand or look for the replacement. But if you're just going to get rid of them because of the 10K, you need to understand what that's going to mean in terms of replacing them. So really making it basic, I think. And again, a lot of this data, I think HR is flooded with data. They're flush with data. It's just about how do you extract the right thing for the right audience. And also, I think it's important to understand what's the objective? What are you trying to get buy-in for? How are you what are you trying to convince people of? And I think that presenting the data in a way that it only doesn't just look at sort of the immediate, but also the long term. And I think that's enough too that HR has to say, here's the data that we have. Here's what it tells you in terms of what's going to happen 3 to 6 months from now. But let me tell you what it means for 2 to 3, 5, 7 years from now. And I think that that's something that, especially, organizations, the C-suite, they're definitely looking for longer term impact as well. And I think that's something we should be bringing to the table.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say you hit the nail on the head there, right? Storytelling 101, know your audience. But as part of knowing your audience is sort of knowing how to hook them and what is really relevant to them. And then what do you have within your data that is going to provide that hook or that thing that makes them more interested in what you're bringing?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've worked with organizations, and I can tell you one on the not-for-profit side that I worked with who, they weren't just not-for-profit, right? Lots of government funding, lots of donations. They're a little bit more conservative when it comes to things like learning and development for their executives. And so we were having this situation where they didn't want to invest the money into their CEO to take a few courses that really she needed to take to be able to better manage her staff. They were having issues with turnover and poor morale in the organization. And the cost of the course was $25,000 to take at the university level. And we sat down with their HR department. We pulled out the data. We talked about how many people had left, what the exit interviews told them. And so it's not always quantifiable data. It's a lot of qualitative data, but you can take that and you can, put that into sort of the quantity and what that means in terms of the impact of the organization. So that's exactly what we did. We said, this is how many people have left. Here's the reasons they're leaving. She's really great at everything else. We need to help her on the management side. So we made the business case. She took the course and we told them that this is what's going to be the impact in terms of savings for the organization when it comes to, again, a turnover and replacing these individuals and morale. And also, the impact of funding with government funders, because no one wants to see that type of situation unfolding at a do-good, not-for-profit where people are leaving and saying awful things about the CEO. So yeah, I think it's about being able to put it into very, very basic terms that who your audience is can really have that resonate with.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's a good example of translating a people issue, something like turnover engagement, into a financial argument that leadership kind of can't ignore. I'm curious though, like, is there sort of an experience level where you become comfortable with that? Or is that because when you first kind of move into like an HR leadership role, I imagine that that's a little bit of a challenge to feel comfortable doing that. I'm just curious to get your thoughts. Like, at what point did you sort of feel like you had the tools to do that? And what were some of the keys along the way to helping you be able to do that?
Yeah. Look, I think it's changing the frame of mind sometimes in the company that you're working in. We talked about this earlier, that HR being in the admin lane, HR being a cost center. Like, that's the sort of the de facto position that most companies will take, especially medium to small size companies. And so I think that the shift, I think it's less about what level or how many years or what your title is. I think it's much more about the understanding. So are you going to the meetings when you are given opportunities where you are sitting down with leadership outside of HR? Are you asking those questions? Are you listening? Oftentimes that's what I will tell people that I work with, is that, you need to listen to when they're describing what the problem is. You need to listen to what the problem is, and you need to understand, first of all, start with understanding, how does the company make money? If you don't understand how the company makes money, you cannot contribute to those conversations in any sort of meaningful way. And moreover, no one's going to listen to you when you do. So I think that asking the questions can happen at any stage. I do think that as you become more aware how the company generates revenue, it's always about what are the problems, right? What are the problems that the leadership is dealing with, and understanding how you in your department can help to affect change with those problems, solve those problems. And I think that's, understanding how the organization works, what your role is in the organization, and then looking at, we go back to the data, looking at, what is it that you have in your chest of solutions that you can provide to the leadership. So I would tell you that, anyone can, I think it's not really a level thing. I think it's much more about your understanding. And I'll tell you an example. We were working with an organization who was looking to change their recruitment because they were an organization. It was a call center. They had a big part of what they did was a call center that they had. And the turnover, if you know call centers, is atrocious. So there's I think the cost of sale for what they were selling, I think their margins were like so slim, and they were hemorrhaging money at this point because everyone was on the call too long. It was just ridiculous, and they were turning over constantly. So they had somebody who was in talent acquisition, and this person was maybe 2 years out of school trying to get into HR. So of course they go down the talent acquisition route to try to get there. And she came back and she said, we're using a recruiter, and we have these 3-month guarantees. And guess what? Like, they're making a load of money off us because we're turning these people over in that sort of after 3 months or 6 months or whatever the guarantee period was. And she had taken that away, and she said, based on what we're spending, I think it's smarter to bring in 2 in-house recruiters. These are not specialized roles. They're call center. We could find people. So let's bring in, a couple of more talent acquisition people. Let's stop using the recruiters. And she had done up a very basic Excel sheet where she showed how much we were spending and how much we would be saving if we brought these folks in-house. So, I think it can be done at any stage. You just need to understand, how does the company make money, and what can you do to help the company either make that money or then save on the expense? And she got it, even though she was super junior.
It's an interesting time, right? Like AI is everywhere right now. And I'm curious from your perspective, how can it kind of help HR professionals build that commercial fluency, analyze people data in different ways, and maybe communicate insights more persuasively to leadership?
Yeah, I mean, AI is everywhere. Anyone who says they're not using it is lying, right? Because everyone's using it.
Pretty much.
And
Yeah.
so, and every day something new comes out on. I was reading this article the other day about how every job is going to be replaced by AI, right? So that's the big fear out there. And so I was reading this article about how they were talking about how recruitment is definitely one of the ones in HR that's going to talent acquisition is going to be replaced by AI, especially these sort of third party headhunters. There's a lot out there that is a bit of it scaremongering, I think, but no doubt there's a lot of benefit here. So how do I think it can help? Look, I think the very basic way is when you don't know something, having AI explain it to you. And I think that's what often happens, not just in HR, but just generally is when you're not, people are using jargon. You don't know what that acronym stands for. And even if you know it, you have no idea how to talk about it intelligently or sort of relate it back to the work that you do. So for sure, I think that there's a lot that can be done when it comes to just the knowledge building within HR and within any other department. So I would start with that. I think data can be intimidating, very intimidating for people who maybe don't work with it as much or don't really know how to use. I would say, even some things as simple as Excel to extract data and sort of manipulate data. And I think that that's, again, another place where AI, whether it's, you're trying to understand financial modeling, you're trying to extract data to make it more relevant, there's obviously a lot there that AI can do to support you. I always tell my clients, just be mindful of what you're putting out there. Obviously, you want to be very careful about what you're sharing, and we've had situations where people are sharing things that they shouldn't be. So being mindful of, the confidentiality around that. But I think that AI also, can help you to understand when you're looking at your organization, sort of help you to understand what are those risks, even asking it to sort of look at it from the perspective of the CFO or the CEO or whatever, and looking at your data and saying, how would I present this? Or what part of all of this information that I have could I use or could I slice and dice and give to the CEO for it to be something that they can benefit from? So it's a lot of educating that AI can do. A lot of people who are in HR, maybe they started off they were in the support lane, and they are in the admin lane and they really want to get out of that. So being able to use AI to tackle those things that otherwise intimidate you, I think is really, really important. And I think that goes right across the board. And I think that the opportunities to learn also. So when you aren't familiar with some of the language, some of the jargon, whatever it is, being able to have, utilize tools to actually break it down. And also creating efficiency, right? Like you talk about burnout. Burnout is everywhere. The worst burnout I see is people who are, for example, often responsible for those internal investigations, for the employee relations types matters. And that can be really draining. And so it's like, okay, but this is what I do all day long. I really don't have capacity to learn anything else or do anything else or take a course or whatever it is. And so being able to, again, utilize AI to sort of quickly be able to understand or be taught something that you otherwise maybe don't have time to attend that college class or whatever it might be. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here to learn and to understand, and then being able to, again, understand the language and then speak the language. And that helps to sort of propel you forward, I think. And I think AI is great for that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's just a good example of sort of that idea of speaking the language. Like I had to give a strategy presentation and I used it just to challenge my assumptions, like I had opinions on like whether or not that would matter to this person in the audience or that person in the audience. And then I kind of asked it to like give me an assessment of like, should this be in there based on the audience? And it gave me some perspective or views that like I just wasn't. I thought, oh, that's a good
Right.
point. They might be interested in it for that reason. And so, or like, it helped me refine what it was. Like, you don't really need this part because you're kind of the only person that's going to care about that,
And, to your point, if you are somebody who maybe isn't generally invited to those tables where the executives sit, if you are somebody and you are going in to present something, you're pitching something for a new HRIS or some sort of,
Right.
new sort of process, I think using AI to say, okay, this is my audience, to your point, tell me of all of this stuff that I have, what is it that they're going to be the most interested in and how can I best deliver that? And I think that, it will help to instill confidence in people who have really good ideas, really understand what's happening in their department, just don't have, haven't been in that room, don't know how to present to those people. And yeah, I mean, we want to hear from those people, right? Because they're the people who are on the ground, they know what's going on. And you want to affect change, you need to be listening to the people who have all of that information, that data, are talking to your employees, because that's the real stuff, right? Everything else can be sort of manipulated. You want to hear right from those folks who are on the front line what your company needs to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And anything that can help them come into that room with more useful things and things that they feel comfortable talking about, right? So now I'm curious, you've worked in nonprofits, tech startups, construction firms, I mean, across the gamut of industries. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was, where do you see some of the biggest gaps between HR and business strategy across different sectors? And what sort of sector maybe surprised you the most in how it used HR?
I think the mindset, I see there's a big difference still between mindsets that are still that sort of HR is a cost center, right? I mean, we've heard
Hmm.
that before. And I think that those organizations that see it as such are organizations that typically underfund their HR departments, right? So your HR, I'm working with somebody right now, and she's, has responsibility for an organization that's 500 people. There's her and an HR admin, and she's drowning. And there's so many things that she could be doing that would help optimize business processes. It would allow higher retention rates. They'd be able to just bring in better, more qualified, richer sort of staff with richer experience, rather. And she has no time to do that. And so I think that's a lost opportunity there. So I think the underfunding. I also think that, HR isn't, we pay a lot of attention to succession planning when it comes to outside of HR. So we will look at the CEO, what's the plan for the CEO, the CFO, we go one level, the second level, maybe even three levels down when it comes to leadership. I don't know that we look at HR in the same sort of way. I think that people sort of don't consider always that there should be, especially in organizations where there are big HR teams, there's leadership in HR. We have to do the same for HR. So I think that that's an issue. I'd like to come back to the burnout. Like, I think that, burnout is a word that you probably, it's where we're using it a lot. We used it a lot through COVID, post COVID, but really it's quite real, right? When you're in these situations, you're working in HR, you are stretched, you are the one person who is expected to do all the administration. And also organizations that don't even farm out their legal work. They expect HR to really know all of the laws. And I think that's a big ask. And more importantly, I think that's a huge risk when you're asking HR to do that, because the consequence can be quite significant. So I think that that's another area I think we have to talk about is, if people are burnt out, why are they burnt out? And if HR is burnt out, then what does that say about the rest of your staff? And especially if they're the ones who are supposed to be helping to create that culture. What organizations are, what sectors? As I said, I do a lot of work in the tech sector. I would say that that is one of the ones I think that there are significant gaps. We talk about being agile, especially they love to talk about that. I mean, there's a shift, but there's a culture, they really like to promote the culture and the whatever, the ping pong tables and the free food and the whatever. But I think that when it comes to scaling HR in these departments, I don't think they're there yet. And I think that part of that is like, they obviously think about where their funds need to go to. And sometimes product development, as we all know, and going to market, obviously, takes priority. But I think that those organizations, you can't scale if you don't have the right systems in place, if you don't have the right HR in place, the right people in place. And HR brings that to you. So I would say that, some of the most innovative sectors like tech probably have the most outdated people strategies. And I think that that's something that they need to work on. And often what happens is I think it's an impediment to them scaling. They sort of, they're moving forward. They're like, we'll outsource this, or we'll, use a recruiter for that. And that's all fine. There's a lot that you can outsource. I'm not saying that you need to have robust, huge HR departments, but oftentimes they're not even bringing anybody in to deal with the people issues. It's very reactive. And so they bring in someone when there's a problem. I worked with an organization, this is a compliance thing, but I worked with an organization who's doing great things. I mean, they're building this fantastic product, and they were a Canadian office of an American company. And what they weren't doing was they were not paying their staff for stat holidays. They were not paying their staff. They weren't compliant. They weren't, they weren't paying vacation pay. A lot of things they just weren't doing, and not because they couldn't, they just didn't know they were supposed to. And they came to me once they were hit with they had come back and they were being investigated. So that's when they came, and it was just so much more money that they could have saved if they had sort of set up those systems, which they do for everything else, but not for HR. So I think that's probably one of the industries I think that really needs to sort of pull up their socks when it comes to this.
That reminds me of an old tongue twister. My dad used to say, "You don't know what you don't know until you know you don't know it."
Yeah, it's 100%, right? And that's the thing. I tell organizations, like, you do what you do. You this is what you do. You do this best. And I'll talk to CEOs and I'm like, I'll tell you, Dave, it's not even about the money. It really is not. It's just an afterthought. It's like, oh, yeah, right. We didn't even know we were supposed to do that. Okay, so how do we solve this problem? How much is it going to cost? And when they look at how much it's going to cost, it's like, okay, well, I just don't know why we didn't do this before, because now we have to play catch up for the last 3 years where we didn't do this. And had we done it consistently, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in. So a lot of it is just the knowledge of, again, you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Before we go, there's always a couple things I like to do here. The first is I want to give you a chance to tell people more about where they can connect with you, find out more about what you have going on, all of that.
Yeah, we're based here in Canada. We're the Orion groups. We, like you probably heard throughout, obviously I do HR advisory. My team does everything from HR consulting. We work with mostly, I'd say, mid-sized and smaller sized organizations. We work with boards and not-for-profits. So yeah, we're on LinkedIn, Julie Mahfouz Rezvani, the Orion Groups, versus the organization. And you can find us there. And I'm sure somewhere in there, you'd be able to find our website as well. So that's where we're at.
Excellent. And the second thing is we have a little tradition here on the podcast where you get to ask me a question. So I'll turn it over to you. You can ask me anything. It can be about the topic or not, anything you want.
I was actually reading through some really interesting people that you brought on, and I was listening to the podcast and I was reading on your website some really great stuff. And you talked about these really interesting people. And I'm wondering, like, in the discussions you've had, because I haven't, heard all your, 129 podcasts or whatever it is that you have.
It's a lot.
But I mean, some great guests. I'm always curious to know, what sort of, if you were to say, what's one sort of people related, or let's call HR decision that you've seen in your work that is where you've seen sort of HR maybe deviate from its stereotypical path of administration, what have you, whether good or bad, like what was a decision that you saw where really the business was impacted because of a decision that HR, one of your guests, maybe brought to the forefront, or in your own experience, that really changed the business's trajectory?
Gosh, I have a terrible memory. I'm sure that there's something in there. I'm sure there's a bunch of examples from the episodes. For me, like from what I've seen is there was an organization I worked at years ago, and HR really got sucked into sort of the glamour stuff around people, like around office spaces. They advocated for, they spent a significant amount of time sort of talking about how culturally we needed to shift. And they were right about that. We did need a shift, but the issue wasn't that we didn't have a common space with a ping pong table and the beer taps. This was like, they had this big vision. And I don't know who got to present this to the CEO, but it worked. And they opened up this space that was nice, don't get me wrong, but a little bit ridiculous, especially for what it costs. And then a year later, COVID hits within a year, and we no longer needed it. Right, and it sat there derelict for a year,
Right.
And so I can remember thinking like, wow, what a wasted time and money that was, when really what everybody needed was a salary reassessment. That was what was actually needed. Right? Yeah, like people weren't leaving because we didn't have a place to hang out. They were leaving because they weren't happy with what they were getting in rewards. So
yeah.
It was one of those things, like I think that they got really sucked into some of the fads of the time and like what was going on at these like glamour companies. And they thought, well, if we had some of that, and they didn't really do enough polling of everybody to find out, would we actually appreciate that? Or is that what we all needed or wanted? And that was a decision that I know they lost a bunch of money on.
Sure. That's the thing, right? Like you talk about, I was reading the survey from Mercer. Mercer put out this global talent survey. They were talking about exactly that. Like there's disconnect between what HR thinks people need versus what they really need. So they were both aligned when it came to like salary and benefits and things like that. But then you have like HR saying, oh well, self-care. And self-care was, I don't know, whatever, number 6 on their list or something, health and wellness, as they called it. And the employees were like way down at the bottom because they're like, yeah, no, we're good. Like, we'll take care of that ourselves. And so I think it's interesting to hear that. Right? Yeah. Just give me the money and I'll take care of the rest.
I've seen orgs where people really do value that stuff. And like, I've even worked at places where I took advantage of it and it was great. But like, especially now at a time when like, I think like, costs of living have shifted so much and all these other things, like people would rather have a crash course on stocks or like how to manage money or something. You know what I mean? Because like, what's more important to you at the time? Like during COVID, like some of these other things, like these apps, that would give you something to engage with and keep you challenged mentally or whatever. Yeah, that might have been really big at that time. But then when the world opened back up and everything went back to normal, maybe not as much, So, you always have to, I think those are the type of things you always have to listen and adapt.
Listen to your people, 100%. They enjoyed it while they could.
Well, Julie, I want to thank you for coming on today. This was a great discussion. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right, listeners, if you haven't done so already, be sure to head on over to peoplemanagingpeople.com/subscribe. Get signed up for the newsletter. You'll get this podcast and all our other content straight to your inbox. And until next time, listen to your people. Enjoy summer.